Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new to my channel, my name is Michelle, and here on this channel I make mommy videos, so everything from baby updates to baby product reviews and everything in between. So if that's the type of content you like to watch, I'd love for you to consider hitting that red subscribe button so you could see every time I have a new video. So today I'm going to be talking about my formula feeding tips and must-haves and just like things that I've learned over the course of formula feeding. Just a little bit of background story. My daughter was breastfed basically exclusively for about 15 months. Like more like 12 months. At 12 months, I started her on whole milk, and she would drink whole milk, but she still breastfed up until she was 15 months, and she self-weaned. So I didn't have any experience with formula whatsoever with her. I had very little experience with bottles because she refused to take a bottle. And the story with my son was completely different. I felt like he wasn't getting enough. My milk supply wasn't where it was with my daughter, and so I decided to introduce formula at I would say about 4 months, and it turned into probably about 6-7 months is when I was exclusively formula feeding, and that was no longer breastfeeding because it was a lot of pumping, it was just a lot, and supplementing and combination feeding, and it really was a lot of. So that's kind of how I got into formula feeding, and it was a lot of research, a lot of things I had to look into and figure out, and so that's kind of what the background story is with formula. So I'm kind of going to talk to you guys about the tips and the things that I've learned first, and then I will kind of go into the products that I use, the products that I absolutely love, and that made formula feeding a lot easier for me. So the first tip that I have is that it is easy to overfeed a formula fed baby. When babies are breastfeeding, they latch on, they drink. When they're done, they're off. Your milk is a little bit more controlled. I mean, some people do have a faster letdown than others, but overall your body kind of regulates to how much milk they need, how often, and your baby kind of has more control over it. And when it comes to formula feeding, you are the one who has more control over it. So it's easy for them to eat more than they should, and then they usually end up spitting it up. Or what happens is basically their stomach size adjusts to how much they're eating. So if they get used to drinking 3 ounces, then 4 ounces and 5 ounces and 6 ounces, and their stomach just kind of expands to fit the amount that they're drinking. And so it's easy to overfeed them. So that was one of my biggest fears, was to how to regulate how much to give him. And honestly, it depends on each baby. So I can't even say only give your baby this much, but I would say I would look up how much babies would be drinking in breast milk at that time, and then I would kind of keep it very similar for the formula. And obviously the formula sometimes sits longer, is heavier. Babies may eat more frequently when they're breastfeeding, so I would kind of make it a little bit longer and wait for his hunger cues when I would kind of feed him and kind of go based off of that. Also, to go along with that is the breaks, which goes into like pace feeding. So pace feeding is important. Basically, pace feeding is a way to mimic breastfeeding or the flow of breastfeeding. So you would feed your baby the bottle, you would take it out, you'd give them a break, you'd burp them, you'd put them back, you'd feed them some more. And that way, you know, by using the correct nipple size, so make sure you have stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, appropriate for your baby's age, and then making sure that you're giving them breaks while they're feeding and you are burping them and stuff, you can see how much they actually need to eat, how much they want, and they will let you know. But that way, if you mimic kind of what they would be doing while breastfeeding, it will help you to prevent overfeeding your baby. You have to find the right balance of how much formula to give, which I did talk about, which is something that can be difficult. How much does your baby need? How much do you top off if you're breastfeeding? How much do you give them if they're exclusively formula feeding? So you have to kind of do your research, look it up, see what they kind of recommend, and then kind of go based on your baby. For me, I really felt like for him, like less is more. I would always give him a little bit less than what it would recommend for his size, and then see where he was. Did he need more? Was he still hungry? Gave him a little bit time to settle, burped him. If he was fine and he got hungry again, I would feed him a little bit more, but it would prevent him from wanting to gobble up everything at one time, and then I don't really know when he's had enough, and he doesn't know when he's had enough. Another tip is that you can only use formula for a certain time before it goes bad. So if you've taken it out, you've mixed it, you've heated it up, it's sitting out, it's like an hour, and in the fridge it's about 24 hours. So if you mix the formula, you can leave it. So sometimes I would pre-mix his bottles and put it in the fridge. So the next day I just had to stick it in the bottle warmer instead of, you know, measuring it out and shaking it, and he's screaming, and it was just really hectic in the beginning when he was still really small. So yeah, you could leave it in the fridge for up to 24 hours after you've mixed it, and outside it could be there for an hour. So sometimes he would drink it, and I would let the milk like stay for a little bit, and then see if he got hungry again within that hour, I would feed him the rest of that bottle. So that way he didn't feel like, I didn't feel like I was wasting formula, and I also didn't feel like I had to throw it away and I was wasting it, and I didn't feel like I had to force him to eat it so that it wouldn't get wasted. Another tip is that you need to find a formula that works well with your baby's system. So every baby is different. Some are, you know, don't do well with lactose or milk, so they need a soy formula. Some babies need sensitive because, you know, they have some stomach issues. So there's a lot of formulas on the market. It is very overwhelming to find out which one is the best one. But again, that comes back to doing the research, but you need to find one that works well with your baby's system and one that your baby likes. So if your baby is rejecting formula, it could be because they prefer the breast milk, but if the case is that you can't, or if you're formula feeding from the get-go and your baby is not reacting well to the formula, try switching it and see if you find one that will do well with your baby. Once you find a formula that your baby likes and works well with their system, do not switch it if you don't have to. I mean, if you can't find the formula anywhere and you've searched all the stores and you can't find it and you have to feed your baby, yes, you have to pick up a different type of formula. But overall, once you pick a formula and that works, stick with it. It actually can upset and hurt baby's stomach when you switch from one brand of formula to another brand of formula. So try to stick with it, stock up on it, do whatever you have to do. I know that when I started my son on formula, I knew exactly which formula I wanted, which was, I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but it's the Earth's Best organic formula. And the only place I can get it here where I live in Canada is at Whole Foods. And obviously it is expensive formula. I spent a lot of money on formula. There's that too. It is expensive, but that was the only place I could get it. So if there were to ever be a time, which there wasn't, but ever a time where I couldn't get a hold of that formula, I would have been in trouble. I would have had to figure it out. So basically, because of the pandemic and having to line up to get into stores and all that stuff, I was buying sometimes up to 4 cans at a time, so that I would have them. So when I ran out of one, I had more. And before I ran out, I make sure I go to Whole Foods, or if somebody I knew was going to Whole Foods, I'd be like, can you pick up a couple cans? So that I always had on stock. But it's something to keep in mind that, like, you want to make sure you're looking out for sales on your formula, or you're looking out for places where you can buy it. Can you get it online? How available is it? Is it a formula you have to order from Amazon that comes from really far away and you don't know how long? Maybe you need to get a subscribe and save. There's a lot of things just to make sure that you don't run out of stock of the formula that works for your baby. If you have to switch between formulas, so I want to say probably when my son was about 9 or 10 months, I ended up switching him from the Earth's Best Organic formula to the Kirkland's brand formula, which is very similar to, I can't remember, I have to look. If I remember, I'll put it here, but I think it's the Enfamil, or I don't think it's a Similac. I think it's Enfamil, and it's kind of like the off-brand of the Enfamil in the sense that it's the Costco brand of the Enfamil. So I switched him to that because I got a lot more. The Earth's Best Organic is a very small can, and I went through a lot, and so we ended up switching him to the Kirkland's formula at about 9-10 months, and I knew we were only gonna have a couple months left of formula anyways before we switched to whole milk, so I felt like it was okay to switch him. He was a lot older. He wasn't very picky, but to prevent that, what I did was I would always mix the formulas together. So I would put the Earth's Best and the Kirkland's in, and then I slowly just started to decrease the amount of Earth's Best formula that I was putting in and increase the Kirkland's until he was eventually solely on Kirkland's. So it was a very like subtle transition, very slow, so that I could see how he would react to it and how, if he would drink it and if he was okay. And that transition worked really well. It took, you know, a couple weeks to slowly like transition him off of it, but it was the easiest way instead of just kind of going cold turkey, because I don't know how different the formula is going to taste to him. So that's what I found worked well, to switch from one formula to another one. Another important tip is to make sure you pay attention to the stages of the nipples. So that's something I talked about on how to mimic kind of that breastfeeding feeling, but there are 3 different stages typically in nipples for bottles, and there's stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. I don't remember the exact ages, but I will kind of leave below. The ones that I use are the Komotomo. I'll leave kind of what stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 is. So you have to make sure they're using the right nipple for their age, and so that you can control how fast the milk is. It's important to make sure, as I said, with the pace feeding, is that you're burping your baby. You want to be burping your baby during the feeding and after the feeding. So probably, usually with my son, probably at about the halfway mark when he was a little bit older. When he was small, probably I would say every 2 ounces or so, I would burp him and then put him back. And then when he got a little bit older, it would be like halfway through the feeding, I would stop, I'd burp him, I'd put him back. Some babies burp more than others. Some babies need to be burped more than others. Some have more gas than others. It just depends on the baby. But to at least try to burp them and not let them drink the whole bottle at one time, because if they, especially when they're bottle feeding, they tend to get more air into their system, and that is cause of gas pains and things like that. So it's important to burp them frequently to make sure that you're getting that out and that they are kind of pacing themselves when they're eating. Another thing when you're formula feeding is to be prepared when you are feeding on the go. So obviously I had my son in November of 2019. So basically we've been in a pandemic for almost his whole life. Probably when he was about 3 months is when we were officially in lockdown. And so we spend most of our time, if not all of our time, at home. And so I haven't had too much experience with feeding on the go or having to give him bottles in different places or anything like that. So I can't really speak to any gadgets or tips on how to make sure you're doing that. So you kind of have to be prepared. Whatever you need to make that transition easier is gonna be a lot better when it comes to formula feeding on the go. I can honestly say I'm really grateful I didn't have to do a ton of that. It's definitely not like when you're able to just like whip out your boob and just feed your baby anywhere. So you have to be prepared for that. The next thing is make sure you have enough bottles so you're not washing bottles all day. There's something to be said for like the hassle of formula feeding or bottle feeding. Even if you're exclusively pumping and you're using a ton of bottles, it is a pain to be washing bottles all day. So, I mean, sometimes it's a pain because if your bottles that you buy are a little bit more expensive, it sucks to have to shell out that money, but for your sanity, like for my sanity, I made sure I had at least 6 bottles. And that for me was basically the perfect amount. I probably could have done with maybe 1 or 2 more, just because sometimes there were those random, like, even now, like there's those random middle of the night feedings where he wakes up and then I have to use a bottle, so then I have to like wash during the day. But it's nothing compared to when I had like maybe 2 or 3 bottles and I was washing bottles every day when he went down for nap. I was washing all these bottles, and luckily I didn't have a bottle that had a ton of parts, which is a tip. Like, do your research on the bottles, but it was just, you know, the sterilizing and the washing and the constant all day. So I made sure I had enough bottles so that I could just wash them at night, sterilize them, everything was good, and they were good to go. So that is an important tip. And the last thing that I have for my tips or things that I've learned is to do your research. And this comes to, like, this applies to everything that has to do with babies. You're just always trying to make sure that you are keeping your baby healthy and safe. And so feeding is one of those big things that you want to make sure you're doing the right thing or the right thing at that time for your baby, and that means you need to be informed and make informed decisions. I'm sure there are some more, but those are the ones that I think are like my top ones that if I didn't have those information, like if I didn't have that information, I would have been completely lost. Future editing me popping in just to say that as I was editing this video, I realized how long it was, and instead of putting up a really long video that maybe you guys don't get through or you don't have the time to watch, I decided I'm going to split it into 2 parts. So this is part 1, which is the tips for formula feeding and the things I've learned, and then part 2 will come out next week, and that will be all the must-have and products that I use that were very helpful. So that's why I decided to split these into 2 parts just to make it a little bit easier. So that being said, thank you guys for watching the first part of this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you guys in part 2. Bye guys.